Dakota Territory, 1888. While his neighbors raced to finish their cabins before winter, Lars Halverson was still hauling fieldstone in late September. They called it wasteful. They called him a fool. He was building a stone wall 12 inches away from his log cabin, running the full length like a low fort around a house. Neighbors laughed at his rock fence for a cabin. They built single log walls with mud chinking and called it good enough. He spent 10 extra days stacking 8 inches of dry fieldstone, then packed the 12-inch gap with loose hay until it was firm but not crushed. Then January 12th arrived. The school children's blizzard hit without warning. 60-mile-per-hour winds. Deadly cold that turned the plains murderous. Standard cabins became ice boxes, drafts pouring through every seam, stoves burning constantly but heating the outdoors. But that stone wall cabin? A neighbor stepped inside and stared at the thermometer. 68 degrees. His own cabin, same storm, same fuel. 47 degrees. 21 degrees warmer, bought with stone and stubbornness. What did Lars understand about wind, dead air, and heat that everyone else missed? And how did his excessive preparation become the difference between comfort and frostbite when the plains turned deadly? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and state. We love reading where these documentaries reach. The wind hit Dakota Territory like thrown gravel that January night in 1888, and when Silas Pritchard stepped through Lars Halverson's cabin door, he couldn't believe what the thermometer nailed to the log wall read. 68 degrees. Outside, his own cabin, built the same month with the same materials and heated by the same class of iron box stove, registered 47 degrees on a thermometer he'd checked twice, convinced it, was broken. Same storm, same fuel scarcity, 21 degrees difference bought with stone, and what most folks had called Norwegian stubbornness. The cabin looked normal enough from the inside, 14 by 18 feet of notched pine logs, mud, and moss chinking, a simple iron stove drawing clean through a straight stovepipe. But step outside, and the structure told a different story. A stone wall ran the full length of the cabin 12 inches off the log wall, standing 7 feet high and built of dry stacked fieldstone pulled from the creek bottom and hauled by wagon through late summer. What neighbors had called a rock fence for a house now made perfect sense as wind-driven snow piled against it instead of against the logs themselves. Lars had endured 3 months of ridicule for that wall. Silas himself had been among the loudest critics, watching Lars stack stone while other homesteaders focused on what mattered, getting a roof overhead and a stove burning before the weather turned. The local assumption ran simple and practical. If you're cold, burn more wood. Fuel was hauled in by wagon, traded for labor, or rationed according to what a man could cut and split in daylight hours, but the solution to heat loss was always more fire, not more building. But Lars had watched how wind-driven infiltration turned a cabin into a bellows, pushing warm air out through every gap while forcing cold air in through seams that looked tight in calm weather. He'd seen neighbors feed their stoves every 20 minutes during storms, keeping the firebox red hot while frost still formed on the inside walls 3 feet from the flames. The cabin became a machine for heating the outdoors, and no amount of additional fuel could keep up with convective loss when 60-mile-per-hour winds found every crack in the chinking. The stone wall changed the physics entirely. Wind shear hit the outer barrier first, leaving the 12-inch gap as dead air buffer that couldn't circulate fast, enough to carry heat away. Lars had packed that cavity with loose prairie hay, not crushed tight, but firm enough to create thousands of small air pockets that trapped still air the way sawdust trapped cold in an icehouse. The principle was simple. Moving air steals heat, but dead air preserves it. He'd learned the technique from watching how ice was stored through prairie summers. Cold storage buildings used layered wall strategies with outer air spaces, insulation layers, and inner dead air chambers because tests showed that airflow control mattered more than wall thickness. A 12-inch stone wall wasn't insulation, it was wind control. The real insulation happened in the gap, where hay created trapped air pockets that couldn't move fast enough to conduct heat through to the outer barrier. Silas examined the construction with the eye of a man who'd built his share of claim cabins. The stone wall sat on a shallow rubble trench that kept the base from pumping mud during freeze-thaw. Cycles. Fieldstone was dry-stacked wider at the bottom, tighter at the top, with through stones every 3 feet binding the wall together without mortar. Flat capstones angled outward shed meltwater away from the gap, and a small inspection point low on the leeward side let moisture escape so the hay stayed dry and effective. The technique wasn't Norwegian innovation, it was borrowed logic from multiple sources that Lars had synthesized into something that worked on the northern plains. He'd talked with Old Elk, a Lakota handyman who'd explained how plains people had always used windbreaks and smart sighting to manage exposure when wind was the real enemy. Break the wind first with external barriers, then worry about interior heat. Indigenous shelters weren't built to fight the weather. They were positioned and layered to redirect it. Lars had also spent time with Ephraim Klein, a carpenter who'd built ice houses where success depended on dead air spaces and dry insulating fills. Klein's rule was practical. If unwanted airflow ruins ice storage, it will ruin heat retention. Air movement was the thief in both directions, and the solution was always layers, outer control, middle insulation, inner protection. The proof was measurable that night as the schoolchildren's blizzard turned the plains murderous. Silas's cabin, built to community standard with single log walls and tight chinking, leaked heat through infiltration that no amount of stove feeding could replace. Every gap in the chinking became a chimney when wind pressure drove the exchange. Cold air forced in low, warm air pulled out high, the cabin itself drawing harder than the stovepipe. But Lars's stone skin cabin sat in calm air. The outer wall broke the wind completely, so the log wall experienced no pressure differential to drive infiltration. The hay-filled gap stayed mostly still, creating the thermal barrier that kept interior heat from conducting through to the outside. The same iron stove that struggled to maintain 47 degrees in Silas's cabin held 68 degrees steady in Lars's, burning fuel every 45 minutes instead of every 20. The 21-degree difference wasn't magic. It was controlled airflow applied to frontier conditions. The stone wall didn't add heat. It prevented the wind from stealing heat that was already being produced. The gap didn't generate warmth. It stopped convective loss that made heating futile. The method worked because it addressed the real problem. On the northern plains, wind makes every crack behave like a chimney, and conventional chinking couldn't seal tight enough to stop infiltration when storms brought sustained pressure. As Silas stood in the warm cabin listening to wind hammer the stone wall outside, he understood why his own approach had failed. He'd been fighting symptoms instead of causes, adding fuel instead of controlling loss, trusting familiar methods instead of examining why those methods struggled under prairie conditions. The Norwegian hadn't built a better cabin, he'd built a cabin that worked with physics instead of against it. The argument started in July, 3 months before the blizzard proved who was right. Silas Pritchard stood in the shade of Lars Halvorsson's half-built cabin, watching the Norwegian stack fieldstone with the methodical precision of a man building a fort instead of a homestead shelter. The conversation that followed would define how the community understood heat, wind, and the difference between building fast and building smart. Conventional frontier wisdom ran simple and practical. Chink the cracks between logs with mud and moss, keep the iron stove roaring when temperatures dropped, and accept drafts as an inevitable part of plains life. Men built single-wall log cabins because they worked fast, used familiar skills, and got families under a roof before weather turned dangerous. The method had carried settlers across the continent for generations, and questioning it seemed like questioning gravity itself. But Lars refused the standard approach, and his reasoning cut straight to the heart of how heat moved through a building. He'd watched wind-driven infiltration turn neighbor cabins into bellows systems where warm air was pushed out through gaps, while cold air was forced in through every seam that looked tight in calm weather. The cabin became a machine for heating the outdoors, no matter how much fuel went into the firebox or how carefully the chinking was applied between logs. Silas represented community knowledge that had worked in other places under different conditions. His experience with log construction was real and extensive. He could notch joints that fit tight, mixed chinking that sealed gaps, and position stoves for maximum draft efficiency. His objection to Lars's method wasn't ignorance, but practical concern. The Norwegian was spending labor on stone walls when he should be breaking ground, stacking firewood, and completing the dozen other tasks that determined whether a homestead survived its first winter. The technical disagreement centered on airflow control versus fuel management. Silas trusted the established model, seal the obvious gaps, burn more wood when cold penetrated, and rely on stove placement and chimney draw to move warm air through the living space. If heat escaped, the solution was more heat. If drafts persisted, the answer was better chinking and additional fuel reserves. Lars approached the problem from a different angle, treating the cabin like a cold storage box where controlling airflow mattered more than adding heat. He'd studied how indigenous shelters solved wind differently across the northern plains, where survival depended on understanding that moving air was the enemy, not cold air itself. Plains tribes used external windbreaks, even around temporary structures, piling brush around winter camps and positioning shelters to use terrain and vegetation as barriers against sustained wind pressure. The connection to proven building science came through Ephraim Klein, the traveling carpenter who'd worked on ice houses throughout Minnesota and the eastern Dakotas. Klein's trade knowledge was specific and measurable. Successful cold storage required dead air spaces, dry insulation layers, and external barriers that prevented air circulation from carrying temperature through wall systems. The principle worked in both directions. If dead air preserved ice through summer heat, it could preserve warmth through winter cold. Lars had absorbed this logic and applied it to homestead construction using materials available on the northern plains. Instead of fighting wind infiltration with better chinking, he planned to stop wind from reaching the log wall entirely. The 12-inch gap between stone barrier and cabin wall would create a still air buffer filled with loose prairie hay, combining windbreak function with insulation mass in a single system. The Chata method challenged assumptions that ran deeper than construction technique. Frontier building emphasized speed and economy because delayed completion meant exposure to weather that could kill families before shelter was finished. Every day spent on non-essential work was a day that brought winter closer without corresponding protection. Lars's stone wall looked like luxury construction that ignored basic homestead priorities, but the Norwegian's reasoning was grounded in physics that Silas couldn't refute, even when he disagreed with the priorities. Wind shear created pressure differentials that drove air exchange through gaps too small to see but large enough to matter when sustained gusts hit exposed walls. Chinking sealed visible spaces but couldn't address the fundamental problem. Air under pressure found ways through wall systems that looked solid under calm conditions. The hay-filled gap would function like the sawdust layers in an ice house, creating thousands of small air pockets that couldn't circulate fast enough to conduct heat from interior to exterior. The stone wall would break wind pressure before it reached the log wall, eliminating the driving force that made infiltration devastating during storms. The system addressed causes rather than symptoms, controlling heat loss instead of simply adding heat input. Silas understood the theory but questioned whether the labor investment made sense under frontier conditions. Hauling 8 to 10 tons of fieldstone from creek bottoms and stacking it into a 7-foot barrier required workdays that could be spent on activities with more certain returns. Breaking ground, cutting firewood, and securing adequate food stores were immediate necessities that couldn't be postponed for experimental building techniques. The community response reflected practical concerns that went beyond construction methods. Homesteading required men to balance competing demands for time, labor, and materials under conditions where mistakes could prove fatal. Building methods that worked elsewhere might fail under plains conditions, but proven techniques offered predictable results, even when those results were imperfect. Old Elk had explained the indigenous perspective during conversations that summer, emphasizing that plains peoples didn't fight weather, but redirected it using terrain, vegetation, and structural positioning that worked with natural forces instead of against them. External control through windbreaks and smart siting preceded interior heating because calm air was easier to warm than moving air was to stop once it gained momentum. The argument revealed deeper differences in how men approached problems under uncertainty. Silas trusted incremental improvements to known methods, better chinking, more fuel, improve stove positioning, because those changes built on community knowledge that had been field tested across multiple seasons. Lars committed to systematic change based on principles borrowed from other applications, accepting short-term risk for potential long-term advantage. By late September, when Lars was still stacking stone while neighbors finished their roofs, the community had chosen sides. Some watched his progress with curiosity, wondering whether Norwegian stubbornness would produce useful innovation or expensive failure. Others dismissed the entire project as misplaced pride that ignored basic homestead priorities. The approaching winter would settle the argument with measurements that couldn't be disputed. The mockery intensified through August as Lars Halvorsen continued hauling fieldstone while his neighbors measured progress by roofs completed and stoves installed. Tom Weller had chinked his cabin walls and cut 2 cords of firewood in the time it took the Norwegian to stake his offset line and begin the foundation trench. Hannah Baird watched from her own claim as Lars spent entire days positioning stones with the careful precision of a mason in country that barely had trees, let alone skilled stonework. The step-by-step construction process revealed why the method demanded so much time and why shortcuts would destroy its effectiveness. Lars began by staking the 12-inch offset line around his completed log cabin, using twine and wooden stakes to mark exactly where the stone wall would rise. The measurement was critical. Too narrow, and the air gap couldn't function as insulation. Too wide, and structural stability became impossible without mortar that he couldn't afford and didn't trust to survive freeze-thaw cycles. The foundation work started with a shallow rubble trench dug 8 inches deep and filled with creek gravel and smaller stones. This base prevented the wall from pumping mud during spring thaws and provided drainage that kept moisture from accumulating against the log cabin itself. The trench required 2 full days of digging and another day hauling gravel, work that neighbors considered preparatory delay when winter approached faster than any man could build. Dry stacking fieldstone demanded skills that most homesteaders hadn't developed because frontier construction emphasized speed over permanence. Lars selected stones by size and shape, placing wider pieces at the bottom courses and reserving flatter stones for the upper layers. Every 3rd or 4th foot, he positioned through stones that extended completely across the 8-inch wall thickness, binding the structure together without mortar and preventing the outer face from separating under wind pressure or frost action. The physical demands of the project became apparent as summer progressed into September. Each wagon load delivered roughly 1 ton of fieldstone hauled from creek bottoms nearly 2 miles from the claim. Lars estimated he would need 8 to 10 loads to complete the wall, meaning 8 to 10 days spent exclusively on stone gathering before construction could even begin. Neighbors calculated those same days in terms of ground broken, firewood cut, or other homestead tasks that produced more certain survival value. Building the wall itself required techniques borrowed from both icehouse construction and indigenous building practice. Lars worked in courses, ensuring each layer was level before beginning the next, using wooden stakes and twine to maintain consistent height and alignment. The stones were fitted carefully but not perfectly. Small gaps between pieces would allow air movement that prevented ice formation, while maintaining structural integrity under wind load. The cavity filling process demanded the most precise attention because the entire system's effectiveness depended on creating proper insulation without compromising drainage or structural stability. Lars used loose prairie hay cut from his own land, placing it in 6-inch lifts and packing it firmly, but not crushing it into dense mass that would lose insulating value. Each lift was checked for evenness before the next layer was added, ensuring the hay filled the space completely without creating voids where air could circulate freely. Ephraim Klein visited during the filling process and explained why the technique worked so effectively in cold storage applications. The hay created thousands of small air pockets that couldn't move fast enough to conduct heat through the 12-inch barrier, while the loose packing allowed sufficient air movement to prevent moisture accumulation that would rot both the hay and the log wall. The balance between stillness and circulation required careful judgment that couldn't be rushed or approximated. The capstone installation represented the most technically demanding aspect of the construction. Lars selected the flattest fieldstones available and positioned them with a slight outward angle that would shed water away from the gap, while providing a finished appearance that suggested permanence rather than expedient piling. Each capstone overlapped its neighbors and extended slightly beyond the wall face, creating a drip edge that threw meltwater clear of the structure below. Tom Weller stopped by during the capping work and openly questioned whether the investment made economic sense. The stone represented 20 days of labor counting hauling and construction time, plus the cost of hay that could have been sold or used for animal feed. A standard cabin could be chinked and weatherproofed in 3 days using materials that cost nothing but gathering time. The additional protection might prove valuable, but the certain costs seemed disproportionate to the uncertain benefit. Lars addressed these concerns by explaining the long-term calculations that drove his building decisions. Firewood on the northern plains was hauled by wagon or traded for labor because natural timber was scarce, and cutting deadfall required travel to distant creek bottoms. A cabin that burned 20% less fuel would pay for its additional construction cost within 2 seasons. Not counting the reduced labor of maintaining constant fires during extended cold periods. The drainage considerations became apparent as autumn rains began testing the wall system. Lars had included a small inspection opening low on the leeward side where moisture could escape and the haze condition could be monitored without dismantling the structure. This detail separated successful cold storage technique from amateur attempts that failed when accumulated moisture destroyed insulation, effectiveness, and promoted rot in wooden components. Hannah Baird observed the construction process with growing interest, recognizing that a technique requiring fewer trees and less manufactured materials might suit her own situation better than conventional methods that assumed abundant timber and multiple strongmen for heavy lifting. The stone work was time-intensive but didn't require skills that a careful person couldn't learn, and the materials were available on most claims without purchase or trade. By late September, when other homesteaders were splitting firewood and banking their cabins with sod for additional protection, Lars was completing his wall with methodical attention to details that seemed excessive until their purpose became clear. The final inspection revealed a structure that looked substantial enough to last decades, not just survive one winter, built with principles that could be adapted to different materials and varying local conditions. The community's response remained skeptical, but increasingly curious as the completed wall demonstrated craftsmanship that commanded respect even from critics who questioned its necessity. The approaching winter would test whether Norwegian persistence had produced useful innovation or expensive experiment, but the construction itself proved that frontier building could incorporate techniques from other applications when men were willing to invest time in understanding principles rather than simply copying familiar methods. January 12, 1888, arrived with deceptive calm across the Dakota Territory. Children walked to school in temperatures that felt almost mild for midwinter, and homesteaders went about their morning chores without the heavy clothing that brutal cold demanded. By noon, the sky had turned an ominous gray-green that experienced plains dwellers recognized as the signature of sudden weather change. But the violence of what followed caught even veteran settlers unprepared for conditions that would claim lives within hours. The schoolchildren's blizzard struck with meteorological fury that transformed familiar landscapes into killing fields. Temperatures plunged 40 degrees in less than 3 hours, while winds built to sustained velocities approaching 60 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally with enough force to blind anyone caught in the open. Visibility dropped to zero as afternoon turned the color of twilight, and the combination of wind and cold created conditions where exposure meant death in minutes rather than hours. Tom Weller's cabin became a laboratory for conventional frontier heating as the storm reached peak intensity. His single log walls with mud and moss chinking had seemed adequate during normal winter weather, but the sustained wind pressure drove infiltration that turned his stove into a futile exercise in heating the outdoors. Cold air poured through gaps that were invisible in calm conditions, while warm air was pulled out through seams that had tested tight during construction. The cabin itself began drawing harder than the stovepipe, creating a bellows effect that made warming impossible regardless of fuel consumption. The iron box stove in Tom's cabin demanded feeding every 20 minutes as he fought to maintain interior temperatures that dropped steadily despite constant attention to the firebox. Frost formed on the inside walls within 3 feet of the flames, and water buckets near the stove developed. skin ice that thickened throughout the afternoon. Blankets stiffened as moisture froze, and the cabin became a harsh environment where survival required layers of clothing that made normal activity difficult. Hannah Baird experienced similar conditions in her own standard-built shelter, watching helplessly as carefully hoarded firewood disappeared into a stove that couldn't keep pace with heat loss driven by wind infiltration. The mathematics of fuel consumption became desperate as she calculated remaining wood against storm duration, realizing that even perfect efficiency couldn't stretch her supplies through a prolonged siege of such intensity. The cabin trembled under wind pressure that found every weakness in construction that had seemed solid under normal conditions. Silas Pritchard fought the same losing battle against physics that defeated preparation based on conventional wisdom. His experience with log construction and stove management provided no solution to infiltration, driven by pressure differentials that overwhelmed chinking regardless of quality or thickness. The stove burned continuously at maximum capacity, while interior temperatures continued dropping, proving that adding heat couldn't compensate for structural systems that leaked warmth faster than fuel could replace it. Meanwhile, Lars Halvorsson's stone skin cabin demonstrated the effectiveness of wind control under conditions that tested every aspect of frontier building technique. The outer field stone wall absorbed the full force of 60-mile-per-hour gusts, creating a calm air zone in the 12-inch gap that eliminated the pressure differential driving infiltration in conventional cabins. Snow piled against the stone barrier instead of the log wall, and the hay-filled cavity remained still enough to function as designed insulation. The thermal performance difference became measurable as the storm reached maximum intensity. Lars's cabin maintained 68 degrees with fuel, consumption that matched normal winter heating, feeding his stove every 45 minutes while neighbors struggled with 20-minute intervals that still couldn't prevent interior temperatures from dropping toward dangerous levels. The stone wall didn't add heat to his cabin. It prevented the wind from stealing heat that his stove produced efficiently when not fighting infiltration. The dead air buffer functioned exactly as Ephraim Klein had predicted based on cold storage construction principles. Air trapped in the hay-filled gap couldn't circulate fast enough to conduct heat from interior to exterior, while the stone barrier eliminated convective loss that made heating futile under wind pressure. The system worked because it addressed the fundamental problem rather than treating symptoms that overwhelmed fuel capacity under extreme conditions. Minnie Freeman, the young Nebraska teacher whose documented actions during the blizzard became legendary, understood what the storm meant. For anyone caught without proper shelter, her experience with sudden weather changes on the northern plains had taught her that wind and cold together created killing conditions where minutes determined survival outcomes. Standard preparations that worked under normal winter conditions became inadequate when wind pressure drove infiltration that defeated conventional heating systems. The comparison between heating systems became stark as the afternoon progressed, and fuel supplies dwindled in standard cabins throughout the territory. Tom Weller's careful preparations, adequate firewood, properly installed stove, tight chinking, proved insufficient against sustained wind that found infiltration paths through construction that looked solid under calm conditions. His cabin became uninhabitable despite constant attention to the fire, forcing him to consider desperate measures, including abandoning his shelter for uncertain refuge elsewhere. Hannah Baird faced similar calculations as her fuel consumption accelerated beyond sustainable rates while interior temperatures continued dropping. The storm transformed her cabin from secure shelter into a trap where staying meant freezing while leaving meant certain death in conditions that killed healthy adults within minutes of exposure. Her careful homestead planning had accounted for normal winter severity, but not for weather that overwhelmed conventional building techniques through sustained wind pressure. The physics of the crisis were simple but devastating. Moving air-stripped heat from any surface it contacted, and infiltration driven by pressure differentials turned cabins into wind tunnels, where warm air was forced out while cold air was driven in through gaps too small to see but large enough to matter. Stoves designed for normal heating loads couldn't compensate for convective loss that increased exponentially under sustained wind pressure. Old Elk would later explain that Plains peoples had always understood wind as the primary enemy during winter storms, not cold temperatures alone. Traditional building practice emphasized external barriers that broke wind pressure before it reached living spaces, using terrain and structural positioning to create calm zones where normal heating methods remained effective. Fighting wind infiltration after it began was futile. The solution required preventing wind from reaching interior surfaces. As evening approached and the storm showed no signs of abating, the difference between building methods became a matter of survival rather than construction preference. Lars's stone skin technique had transformed experimental building into proven technology under the most demanding test conditions the northern plains could provide. The 21-degree temperature advantage wasn't theoretical comfort. It was the margin between habitability and abandonment when conventional wisdom met forces that exposed the limitations of familiar methods. The reversal came at dawn. On January 13th, when Tom Weller knocked on Lars Halverson's door with frostbitten cheeks and a single desperate question. "How far off the wall did you set it?" His own cabin had become uninhabitable during the night as infiltration overwhelmed his heating capacity, forcing him to abandon shelter that had seemed adequate under normal conditions. The 21-degree difference between cabins had meant the difference between sleep and survival vigil, between controlled fuel consumption and desperate wood burning that couldn't keep pace with wind-driven heat loss. Lars didn't gloat over vindication that had cost his neighbors so dearly. Instead, he explained the construction process with the methodical precision of a man who understood that shared knowledge served community survival better than individual advantage. The 12-inch offset wasn't arbitrary. It provided enough space for effective insulation while maintaining structural stability that didn't require mortar or specialized masonry skills. The technique could be adapted using materials available on any homestead where fieldstone could be gathered from creek bottoms or ridge outcrops. Hannah Baird arrived before the morning was half spent, leading a small group of settlers who had spent the night feeding stoves continuously while watching interior temperatures drop toward levels that threatened survival. Her practical mind had already calculated the labor and materials required to adapt the stone skin method to her own cabin using boards or sod where fieldstone wasn't available. The principle remained constant: create an external barrier that stopped wind pressure, then fill the gap with insulating material that trapped dead air. The community adoption began immediately as neighbors examined the wall system that had performed so effectively under conditions that defeated conventional construction. Silas Pritchard traced the stone courses with experienced hands, noting how through stones every 3 to 4 feet bound the structure without mortar, while capstones angled outward shed water away from the hay-filled cavity. The craftsmanship was solid, but not beyond the skills of careful homesteaders willing to invest time in understanding principles rather than rushing through familiar techniques. Within weeks, variations of the method appeared throughout the territory as settlers adapted the concept to local materials and individual capabilities. Some copied the 12-inch offset exactly using fieldstone gathered from creek bottoms and ravines. Others built board storm walls using lumber hauled from distant mills, creating the same windbreaking function with materials that demanded less physical labor, but required cash expenditure that many homesteaders couldn't afford. Hannah Baird pioneered the sod bank variation that proved most practical for settlers without access to stone or lumber. She built a low earthwork 12 inches from her cabin wall and filled the space with loose hay and prairie grass, creating insulation that used entirely local materials while providing wind protection that significantly reduced infiltration. Her fuel consumption dropped by roughly 1/3 during subsequent storms, validating the principle even when executed with different materials and techniques. The method's effectiveness spread beyond immediate survival benefits, as homesteaders discovered that reduced fuel consumption meant less time spent cutting and hauling firewood during short winter days. Tom Weller calculated that his adapted storm wall, built with a combination of fieldstone and salvaged boards, would pay for its construction cost within 2 heating seasons through reduced wood requirements alone. The labor investment that had seemed excessive during construction proved economical when measured against ongoing fuel savings. Old Elk's validation carried particular weight among settlers who had learned to respect indigenous knowledge about plains survival. His explanation of traditional windbreak practice provided historical context that made the stone skin technique seem less like Norwegian innovation and more like adaptation of field-tested principles that plains peoples had used for generations. External wind control preceded interior heating because moving air was impossible to warm efficiently, but calm air could be heated with reasonable fuel consumption. Ephraim Klein documented the technical aspects that made successful adaptation possible for homesteaders without specialized building experience. The key measurements included the 12 to 14-inch offset that provided optimal insulation space, the 6 to 8-inch stone thickness that resisted wind pressure without requiring excessive materials, and the loose-packed hay installation that created trapped air insulation without compromising drainage or structural integrity. The community response revealed how quickly practical innovation spread when survival benefits were measurable and construction methods were accessible to ordinary homesteaders. Men who had mocked the stone wall as wasteful labor began planning similar modifications to their own cabins, recognizing that winter would return with the same violence that had exposed the limitations of conventional building techniques. The long-term legacy extended beyond individual cabin improvements, as the territory developed building practices that incorporated wind control as a standard element rather than experimental addition. New homesteaders received advice that emphasized external barriers and dead air insulation alongside traditional recommendations for log selection, chinking, and stove positioning. The hard-won lesson became community knowledge that prevented repetition of the same mistakes under similar conditions. Later building science would provide technical vocabulary, infiltration, convective loss, thermal bridging, for phenomena that frontier builders learned to control through practical experience and measurable results. The principles remained constant across different applications. Moving air carried heat away from any surface it contacted. Dead air preserved temperature differences when properly contained, and external barriers provided more effective control than internal heating could overcome under extreme conditions. Hannah Baird became the most systematic adopter and teacher of adapted techniques, helping other settlers implement variations that matched their specific materials and labor capabilities. Her modifications proved that the essential principle, wind control through external barriers and dead air insulation, could be executed successfully using different approaches that shared the same underlying physics, but adapted to varying resources and construction skills. The methods spread throughout the region during the following seasons, demonstrated how survival knowledge evolved when shared openly rather than guarded as individual advantage. Settlers who had initially dismissed the stone wall as Norwegian eccentricity became advocates for building techniques that incorporated wind control as essential rather than optional protection against plains weather that could turn lethal without warning. The transformation from mockery to adoption reflected deeper changes in how frontier communities approached building under conditions where conventional wisdom proved inadequate. The blizzard had taught expensive lessons about the difference between construction that looked adequate and construction that performed effectively when tested by weather that exposed every weakness in techniques that seemed proven under normal conditions. Preparation that looked excessive in calm weather became recognized as necessary margins when weather turned mean, and the stone skin method established new standards for what constituted adequate shelter on the northern plains, where wind was always the enemy that no amount of additional fuel could overcome without proper structural protection.